There's one financial concept we all have no choice but to get familiar with the moment we become an adult. Debt. For almost everyone on the planet, it shows up in the form of student loans, credit card debt, mortgages, or business loans, you name it. So have you ever wondered what would actually happen if your debt got completely out of control to the point where there was no way to pay it back with what you earn? In the United States, miss enough payments and debt collectors start hounding you. Creditors can freeze the cash in your bank account and come after your assets. Your last resort could be declaring bankruptcy, which might wipe the slate clean, but would destroy your credit score for up to 10 years. That means for a decade, you'll be marked as a high-risk borrower, and you might struggle to rent an apartment, get a loan, or sometimes even land a new job, because a credit check can follow you into places you would never expect. Those are the consequences at the personal level. Owe more than you can pay back, and the system makes sure you pay a heavy price for it. For regular people, there's not much of an escape. So what about at the national level? These days, it's hard to escape the doomer narratives all over the mainstream news and YouTube about how Japan is in a serious debt crisis, how Japan is a ticking financial time bomb, and how Japan's demise is the warning for the US, etc. And don't get me wrong, on the surface, Japan's numbers look terrifying. The headline figure you keep hearing is that Japan's public debt exceeds 250% of GDP, meaning 2.5 times the size of its entire economy. A nation's economy is basically everything it produces in a year, what economists call gross domestic product, or GDP. Think of GDP as a country's rough equivalent of a person's yearly income, though technically it measures the entire economy's output, not just what the government actually collects in taxes. Now, that 250% figure is not exactly accurate, and I'll show you why later, straight from the source that everyone quotes. But for now, a debt to GDP ratio of 250% would be like you earning $50,000 a year and owing $125,000. No wonder people look at that and think, how the hell has this country not gone bankrupt already? But here's the thing. If a country really worked like a person, then in theory, yes, Japan should have already gone bankrupt. But does a country really work like an individual person when it comes to borrowing money? I'm not a professional economist, okay? But I think we can all agree that something just doesn't add up here, right? Either every doomer headline is totally accurate and you can stop watching this video right now, or we can explore together the nuances that may be missing from these headlines, ask questions, and hopefully learn a few things about how debt works at the national and international level. Is Japan really about to fall off a debt cliff and go totally bankrupt? If not, what does this story tell us, if anything, about where the United States is headed? Before we dive in, Japan's debt is exactly the kind of topic where local context can easily get lost in the research. That's why we partnered with Ground News, which solves a problem I've personally wanted to address for years. Ground News is not a news outlet. It's a news comparison app and website that gives me transparency when I'm sifting through data and reports on each topic we cover on our channel. It lets you access worldwide sources that your algorithm probably isn't surfacing. For example, search Japan remilitarization on Ground News, and you'll see coverage around China's reaction to Japan's remilitarization initiatives. You get multiple headlines, a summary, and a source breakdown. In this case, many outlets covering the story leans noticeably right. You can also see factuality ratings and ownership details for each source so you know how reliable the coverage is. There's also the blind spot feed showing stories ignored by either side of the political spectrum. This is the kind of tool I wished more people used before forming opinions. So if you're someone who wants to stay informed without being manipulated by algorithms, subscribe to Ground News and get 40% off the Vantage plan by scanning the QR code, going to ground.news/boss, or clicking the link in the description below. Let's get back to the deep dive. So whenever I have to do an explainer on a complex subject like this, I tend to start off by asking a lot of the underlying assumptions most people just take for granted. And I often end up asking a lot of dumb questions because I honestly don't know much. For example, what even is debt? Why does a country go into debt in the first place? How does a country, as opposed to a person, even borrow money? And who does it borrow from? You see what I'm saying? Because answering these basic questions and looking at the actual environment the Japanese government was making these decisions in might just point us towards some useful insight or even a solution. So let's take a step back and see if we can go way back in time to find a point where Japan had little to no national debt, if a period like that even existed. And I think this is an interesting place to start. Japan lost World War II, but what you might not know is that Japan came out of that war drowning in debt. By 1944, with the war almost lost, the government's debt had ballooned to around 170% of the size of its entire economy. By the way, this isn't the same debt that Japan carries today. That war debt got mostly wiped out, but more on that in a bit. So how did Japan dig itself that deep in the first place? To fund its war machine, Japan had borrowed money on a massive scale, mostly from its own people. And the main way a government borrows is by issuing what's called bonds. A government bond is basically an IOU. The government needs cash today, so it sells you a bond. You hand over your money, and in return, it promises to pay you back later with a little interest on top. During the war, Japan sold these as war bonds, leaning hard on patriotism to get ordinary Japanese citizens to buy them. But selling bonds wasn't enough. So the Bank of Japan, the country's central bank, did something it had already been doing since the early 1930s. It printed money to buy up the government's bonds directly. Yeah, I know it sounds a little weird because the Bank of Japan is technically part of the government, so it's like the government was borrowing money from itself. Hold on to that idea because it turns out to be one of the most important pieces of this entire story. Anyway, between leaning on its own people and printing money, Japan paid for the war. And when it surrendered in August 1945, it was left in ruins. Cities flattened, factories gone, about a quarter of the nation's wealth wiped out, and the government drowning in war debt. So what happened to the mountain of debt? Like I said earlier, it got wiped out, but not by paying it off, through inflation. After the war, the Japanese government kept printing money, and prices spiraled completely out of control. Wholesale prices rose about 13 times over in just 3 years, from 1946 to 1949. 13 times. If that sounds crazy, it was. To give you a sense of how broken things got, people turned to the black market just to buy rice, which could sell for something like 100 times the official price. People's life savings became nearly worthless almost overnight. I've actually heard stories of Japanese families back then burying piles of cash in the backyard, and pretty much all of it turned into worthless paper. So why didn't they just put the money in the bank? Because in an attempt to control the inflation and control the chaos down, the Japanese government straight up froze people's bank accounts in 1946 and forced everyone to swap their old cash for a new yen. They also put strict limits on how much people could actually pull out. So no wonder people didn't want to keep their money in a bank, right? The point is, whether your money was in the bank or buried in the ground, you got screwed either way. But here's the flip side. Ironically, the government's war debt also became worthless by the same inflation because the yen it owed was suddenly worth a tiny fraction of what it used to be. In a real sense, Japan's war debt got inflated into oblivion. The popular narrative about Japan is that it's the country of the lost decades and deflation. But we are talking about a country that went through a period of hyperinflation that triggered national trauma. Rations were implemented, and people literally starved to death because they couldn't get enough food. That's how desperate things had gotten. And that experience scarred the country so deeply that in 1947, Japan passed a law that flat out banned the government from issuing bonds just to cover its bills, and even barred the central bank from directly buying government debt. From around 1949 all the way to 1964, Japan ran balanced budgets, and its national debt fell to around 8% of the size of its economy in the early 1960s. There was one exception to this strict rule. So-called construction bonds, money borrowed to build real things like roads and bridges, which I'll come back to later. Look, I'm going into this much detail not just to give you some history lesson, but to demonstrate that Japan is not an irresponsible or reckless country that just keeps borrowing and spending beyond their means. In other words, there must have been some legitimate reason why a country this disciplined, this allergic to debt, somehow ended up going from single-digit debt to a supposed and misleading 250% of its national GDP. Turns out, there was. And for that, we have to jump forward to the 1980s, near the peak of Japan's economic miracle. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Japan pulled off one of the most stunning periods of economic growth in modern history. This was the era that gave us Sony, Nintendo, and Toyota, and turned Japan into the second largest economy in the world. By then, the trauma of hyperinflation felt like a distant memory. Japanese people, especially the famous salaryman, worked hard, earned stable salaries, and many had what felt like jobs for life. They could actually buy a home and raise a family. Everything was going great. Almost too great. But by the late 1980s, everyone from salarymen to multinational corporations started buying and speculating on real estate because they had money to invest. Banks were handing out loans like candy, treating land as bulletproof collateral. If land prices kept going up, everyone looked rich on paper. And if everyone looked rich, banks felt safe lending even more money. So people borrowed against rising land prices to buy even more land, which pushed prices even higher. Talk about an insane self-feeding loop. Things got so ridiculous that some companies started making more money from financial speculation than from their actual businesses. There was even a famous saying at the time that the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than all the land in California. By the end of the decade, Japan had entered a kind of national delusion that its companies would keep growing forever and the Japanese land would never fall in value. Then, just like that, one of the biggest asset bubbles in modern history exploded. The Bank of Japan had declared war on the bubble and slammed on the brakes by hiking interest rates 5 times from 2.5% to 6%. Why raise interest rates? Because higher rates make borrowing more expensive, which means people are less likely to take out loans just to speculate on real estate. And it worked. Actually, it worked way beyond what they intended. The Japanese stock market fell off a cliff, losing nearly half its value within a year in 1990. Land prices collapsed soon after. The problem was, by then, millions of families and companies had already borrowed enormous sums to buy assets that were suddenly worth a fraction of what they had paid. But the debt didn't shrink with the asset. Whatever you borrowed, you still had to pay back in full. And for many borrowers, refinancing or servicing the debt had become even more painful because interest rates had gone up. So businesses got crushed, bankruptcy started climbing, and people went into survival mode. To be fair, it wasn't as immediately devastating as the hyperinflation period where people were literally starving to death. This was more of a slow bleed. People stopped spending, companies stopped investing, and everyone started paying down debt as fast as possible. Now, if one person or one family tightens its belt, no big deal. But imagine if the entire private sector stopped spending and borrowing money. Japan started going down the path of 1930s style Great Depression because businesses were losing customers, so they had to cut jobs. And those losing jobs have even less to spend, and the whole thing just spiraled down. So the Bank of Japan started cutting interest rates again from 1991 all the way down to effectively 0% by 1999, hoping that cheap money would get people and companies borrowing again. But people didn't bite. Why? Because by that point, everybody had been traumatized by the existing debt they had already taken on. I mean, the last thing you want when you're trying to pay off your existing loan is a brand new loan, right? This is what economists call a balance sheet recession. It happens when asset prices collapse, but the debts used to buy those assets remain the same. So instead of trying to maximize profits, growth, or consumption, companies and households focus on repairing their balance sheets by paying down existing debt. And when everybody does it at the same time, spending disappears from the economy. That's how a bubble crash turns into a long, grinding recession. So the question I had was, where was all the money at this point? In the banks. Because people were doing pretty much nothing but paying back their loans and leaving money in their savings accounts. But even if the banks wanted to lend that massive growing pile of cash and private savings back out, nobody wanted to borrow it, even as the rates kept dropping. So the money just sat there while the economy kept shrinking. By 1992, Japan was already in recession, and the Japanese government had to step in to prevent it from turning into a full-blown Great Depression. How? The government started borrowing all that idle money sitting in the banks by issuing government bonds, those IOUs I talked about earlier. The banks were happy to hand over their dead cash in exchange for a safe, interest-paying government bond. Now, if you're wondering, wait a minute, I thought the Japanese government was banned from issuing bonds after the hyperinflation debacle. Well, remember how I said earlier that construction bonds were one of the exceptions? That's the exception that the government used, borrowing the money to fund a giant fiscal rescue package worth 10.7 trillion yen, or roughly $85 billion at the time. They started building roads, bridges, and other public infrastructure projects. Basically anything to create jobs, put money back into people's pockets, and keep the economy from collapsing. Fun fact, Kansai International Airport opened in 1994 during this broader public works era. And it's a great example of the kind of massive infrastructure Japan was still building around this period. Basically, since the private sector refused to spend, the government became the spender of last resort. And as a result of this massive stimulus package, or actually a whole series of 8 of them, totaling well over 100 trillion yen, or roughly $1 trillion in public spending, Japan was able to avoid the Great Depression type collapse. But what happened in the process was that the private sector's debt problem effectively became the government's burden, because the government was borrowing the very savings the private sector wouldn't spend. Japan's national debt, which had been just 8% of GDP back in the 1960s, ballooned to around 120% after this decade of rescue packages. And it just kept climbing in the decades after, as an aging population piled on even more costs. So hopefully this debunks any narrative that Japan was being irresponsible in racking up its debt. Sure, plenty of economists would argue that Japan made serious policy mistakes as well, that it delayed cleaning up bad bank loans, kept some unproductive companies alive for too long, and poured money into public projects that didn't always create real long-term growth. But the bigger picture is that Japan was trying to stop a private sector debt collapse from turning into a depression. The government accomplished that mission, but it came at a heavy cost. Okay, so now Japan is supposedly sitting on the biggest debt pile in the developed world. By every rule we just talked about, this should have triggered a full-blown crisis, right? The whole thing should have come crashing down. But it didn't. And that's the real mystery we have to explore. Okay, so let's start with the doomsday scenario you keep hearing from mainstream media pundits and content creators. Japan's national debt is 250% of its GDP. And most people just seem to take that at face value. If you're a person, that kind of debt to income ratio would make you think there's no way to pay this off. You'll be totally screwed. Now, technically, I know a nation's GDP is not the same thing as your personal income. GDP is the size of the whole economy, not just the government's tax revenue. But I'm just trying to make the point that when any debt pile looks 2.5 times bigger than the economic base supporting it, your first instinct is to assume the borrower is in serious trouble. But is that actually true? Here's another dumb question. How do you actually pay back debt? Well, if you're a person and let's say you take out a loan, your debt obligation usually consists of 2 components. One is the interest payment on the loan, which is basically the cost of borrowing the money. But just because you're paying interest doesn't mean the loan itself is disappearing, right? At some point, either from the very beginning or by the time the loan reaches maturity, you also have to repay the principal, which is the original amount you borrowed. Together, these required payments are called debt service, and that's what people mean by servicing your debt. So, for example, if you're earning $50,000 a year, but you have a loan of $125,000, which is 2.5 times your yearly income, no one necessarily expects you to pay off the entire $125,000 right away, unless you do so voluntarily because you suddenly win the lottery or something. What matters most is whether you can keep making the required payments. The interest plus whatever portion of the principal you're supposed to repay over time. But if you cannot even handle those payments, that's when you're in real trouble. So what kind of situation is Japan in right now when it comes to handling its debt service obligations? To assess that, we need to first figure out how much Japan actually owes in the first place. My question is Japan's national debt really 250% of its GDP? Let's take a closer look. According to Japan's own Ministry of Finance, the central government's outstanding bonds and borrowings recently hit around 1344 trillion yen, or about $8.6 trillion. Now, according to the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, Japan's nominal GDP in 2025 was estimated at around 664 trillion yen, or roughly $4.4 trillion. So if you measure that central government debt against the 2025 GDP figure, you get roughly 202% of GDP. Even if you go by the IMF's revised methodology, which I'll explain in a second, Japan's public debt figure for 2025 is around 206.8% of GDP. Still a massive number, but it sure sounds a hell of a lot lower than the 250% figure you keep hearing about. So where does the 250% come from? Turns out, the scary headline number comes from the IMF's report on Japan, where Japan's gross public debt for 2023 was listed at around 252% of GDP. Two things here, and this is exactly why I said before that we need to properly define what debt even means. So number one, this was a gross debt figure. Gross debt means you count what the government owes before subtracting what the government owns in financial assets. And number two, the methodology was later revised by the IMF. Here's the nuance. The older figure was based on a non-consolidated approach, meaning it could include internal debt that one part of the government owes to another part of the government. So instead of canceling those internal IOUs out, the calculation could effectively double count debt within the government sector. The IMF later shifted to a consolidated debt figure, which still includes the broader general government sector. I'm talking about central government, local governments, and social security funds, but removes internal debts between those government units so you don't double count government IOUs. The revised methodology also values the debt at face value, meaning the amount legally owed rather than what the debt happens to trade for in the market. To me, this standardized approach sounds way more accurate because it shows how much the Japanese government actually owes and makes Japan's debt number more comparable to other countries' debt numbers. On top of that, in December 2025, Japan also rebased its GDP, which just means they updated the way they measure the size of their economy to reflect more current data. Put the revised debt methodology and the rebased GDP together, and that's how you land at around 206.5%, not 250%. But it doesn't stop there, because like I said earlier, this is still gross public debt. Going back to our personal balance sheet example, if you have a $125,000 loan, that's your gross debt, which is 250% of your $50,000 annual income. But what if you also have $50,000 sitting in your savings account? Then your net debt isn't $125,000 anymore. It's $125,000 minus $55,000, which leaves you with $70,000. And $70,000 against a $50,000 income is about 140%. That's basically what the Japanese government's balance sheet looks like. According to the IMF, Japan's general government financial assets were about 70% of GDP in 2025. If you subtract those assets from the gross debt figure, Japan's net debt comes down to roughly 137% of GDP. Still big, but that's a very different picture from the Japan's 250% in debt and about to go bankrupt tomorrow narrative. But before you think, oh, so Japan's totally fine then? Well, not so fast. These assets aren't all liquid, freely usable assets like spare cash sitting in a checking account. Some are tied up in pension funds, social security related institutions, loans, and other public financial assets that the Japanese government cannot just liquidate to pay off the national debt. So gross debt makes Japan's look more terrifying than it really is, but net debt can make it look cleaner than it really is. The truth lies somewhere in between. But whether it's 137% or 250%, do you know what's more important than the level of debt and what could actually decide the fate of a borrowing nation? who Japan owes the money to. And if you've been keeping up with me this far, you probably already know the answer. That's right. It's mostly Japanese people whose private savings the government effectively borrowed in the form of issuing bonds. And I don't mean some Japanese grandma buying government bonds down at the post office. The actual buyers are mostly big Japanese banks, insurance companies, and giant pension funds. But that's still the people's money, right? Your bank deposits, your insurance premiums, your pension contributions, all pulled together and lent to the government. In other words, this is domestic debt, which isn't great because debt is still debt, but it could be a whole lot worse. Let me give you a perfect example of where this went really bad. Sri Lanka. Starting in the mid-2000s, Sri Lanka went on a borrowing spree to fund big infrastructure projects like roads, ports, and airports. A lot of that money came from foreign creditors, international sovereign bonds sold to global investors, plus major project loans from lenders including China. By 2021, Sri Lanka's public debt had climbed to around 119% of GDP, which is way lower than Japan, right? Only about half. But then COVID hit and wiped out tourism, one of Sri Lanka's biggest sources of dollars. Foreign lenders got spooked and stopped lending. The dollars dried up and there was nothing the government could do because it's not like Sri Lanka can print US dollars. So in 2022, for the first time in its history, Sri Lanka defaulted and went bankrupt. And the moment you do that, the world just cuts you off. No one will sell you anything on credit anymore. They want cash up front in dollars. Do you see the problem? Sri Lanka imports nearly all its fuel and suddenly no one would ship it without being paid in dollars it didn't have. So the result was brutal. Fuel and medicine shortages, inflation over 50%. Eventually, protesters stormed the president's residence until he literally fled the country. That's what a real debt crisis looks like. Japan is the complete opposite. When your lenders are basically your own people, and the debt is in yen, a currency you can print whenever you want, that whole narrative about Japan suddenly going bankrupt just doesn't hold up the way it did for Sri Lanka. Of course, Sri Lanka's crisis had many other causes as well, but for our purposes, the key difference is that Sri Lanka ran out of foreign currency. Japan cannot run out of yen in the same mechanical way. Let's get back to Japan's debt being domestic in nature. Roughly 93% of its regular government bonds are held domestically. For a long time, the main holders were Japanese banks, life insurers, and pension funds. But back in 2013, to fight deflation, the Bank of Japan started printing money to buy up government bonds on a massive scale, mostly from those same private banks, life insurers, and pension funds that were holding them. This policy is called quantitative easing. The result is that the government's single biggest creditor became its own central bank. As of December 2025, the Bank of Japan held 49% of Japanese government bonds. That excludes short-term treasury bills, which are also government debt, but not really the focus of this discussion. Add in the private banks, insurers, and pension funds that held onto the bonds that they didn't sell to the Bank of Japan, and roughly 93% of regular Japanese bonds were still held right at home. Foreign holders, only about 7%, which honestly doesn't sound nearly as scary. But at the end of the day, whether domestic or not, Japan still had to be able to service all that debt. And again, servicing debt means keeping up with interest payments and dealing with the principal when bonds mature. This is why just shouting the total debt number is kind of pointless. Take the United States, for example. Everyone freaks out about America's roughly $39 trillion national debt. And to be fair, that is an insane number. But in the actual US federal budget, principal repayment is not counted as normal spending because maturing treasuries are usually refinanced by issuing new treasuries. The real budget pressure shows up in the interest costs. According to the Congressional Budget Office, net interest payments are projected to be around $1 trillion in 2026. So interest alone, it's up roughly 14% of the US federal budget. That's still very manageable. So what about Japan? Was Japan able to meet its debt servicing obligations? Yes. For the interest component, it paid next to nothing because for about 25 years, the Bank of Japan kept interest rates at basically zero. As for the principal, whenever a bond hits its maturity date, they just rolled it over. They issued a new bond to pay off the old one. Kind of like getting a new credit card to pay off your old one. This is a big reason why debt servicing ate up around a quarter of Japan's annual budget. It was because debt servicing also includes dealing with old bonds as they come due. And as long as rates stay near zero, Japan could keep servicing its debt this way for a very long time. So to recap, those are the three reasons why Japan didn't go bankrupt and probably won't anytime soon. 1, Japan's net debt figure is much lower than the scary 250%, more like 137%. 2, about 93% of regular Japanese government bonds are held domestically. And 3, they've got the capacity to service the debt, which is different from paying off the entire principal. They never have to pay the whole debt pile down to zero as long as they can keep refinancing maturing bonds. The only catch with the third one, though, is that it depends on interest rates staying super low. And for about 25 years, there was no problem because Japan's rates set at basically zero. But as Japan would soon find out, not even 25 years of near zero rates could survive what hit in 2022. So why is it that all of a sudden the media can't seem to stop talking about Japan's debt if they were able to service their debt just fine up until recently? Well, something happened in 2022 that finally broke Japan's 30-year deflation cycle. Russia invaded Ukraine, and global oil, gas, and wheat prices shot up. Japan imports almost all of its energy and a big chunk of its food, so those costs landed straight on Japanese households. And on top of that, the yen was getting weaker, largely because Japan kept rates near zero while the US was hiking aggressively to fight its own inflation. So investors sold low-yielding yen and moved into higher-yielding dollars. And a weak yen makes everything Japan imports even more expensive. So add it all up, after 30 years of flat prices, Japan suddenly had real inflation. It must have been a bit weird for the Bank of Japan to suddenly start thinking about how to control inflation. But anyway, in March 2024, it raised rates for the first time in 17 years, and it kept hiking all the way to 1% by June 2026. Now, 1% compared to other countries doesn't sound that bad, and honestly, it isn't. But here's the doomsday argument. As soon as the rates started climbing, investors smelled more hikes coming, and they started demanding a much higher return to buy Japanese government bonds. That part is true. Recently, the bond market has demanded around 2.7% to buy a 10-year Japanese government bond, and that rate is called a yield. That 2.7% yield is set by the market, and it's obviously not the same thing as the 1% official rate. The yield matters because when the Ministry of Finance issues a new bond, the coupon rate is generally set near that day's market yield. And once a bond is issued, that coupon is locked in for the life of the bond. You with me? So think about it. Whenever an old bond issued at, say, a 0.1% coupon matures, Japan has to refinance that slice of debt at today's rate around 2.7%. On that chunk of debt, that's roughly 27 times the interest it used to pay. So on paper, this really does start to sound like the doomsday scenario. Japan is finally going to go bankrupt. But let me ask you this. Do you think the Japanese government is stupid? Could it be that they saw this coming from miles away and already had safeguards in place? So let's take a look at some of the levers they can pull, including the ones they're in fact pulling right now. Two of Japan's most powerful institutions, the Bank of Japan and the Ministry of Finance, are both taking actions that ultimately serve the same broader goal: stopping inflation, yields, and government financing pressure from spiraling out of control. Start with the Bank of Japan, or BOJ. Its main job right now is to signal to the bond market that it's serious about getting inflation under control. So it's gradually reversing the quantitative easing I mentioned earlier, the money printing to buy bonds, and doing the opposite, called quantitative tightening. Basically, it's printing less money by reducing its monthly purchases of Japanese government bonds. But it's doing this slowly and deliberately so it doesn't spook anyone. So no, the BOJ isn't fully pulling out and leaving a void that triggers a panic sell-off. It's easing back and letting the market do its thing. Now, don't get me wrong, this can still push yields up because investors see the biggest player in the room, the BOJ, stepping back and may demand a higher return. They can't really be helped. But here is the safety net. The BOJ has openly said that if long-term rates start rising too fast, it'll jump back in and ramp up its bond buying again to calm things down. The point is, the BOJ is doing its job to send the right signal that inflation is being handled. That's its responsibility, not solving the debt servicing problem itself. That responsibility falls on the Ministry of Finance. How? The Ministry of Finance itself has a few levers. First, it controls the supply of government bonds, how much to issue and what kind to issue. Instead of flooding the market with more super long-term bonds, like the 20-year, 30-year, and 40-year bonds that investors are most nervous about, the Ministry of Finance has been shifting more of the burden towards shorter and medium-term bonds, like 2-year and 5-year bonds. In fact, Reuters reported that Japan is implementing its lowest super long-term bond issuance in 17 years. Why? Because shorter-term bonds usually have lower yields. The trade-off is that Japan has to refinance them sooner, so this doesn't magically erase the debt problem. But it does reduce pressure on the most fragile part of the bond market, which is the super long end, where yields have been jumping the most and demand has become the weakest. That's the first lever. The second lever is on the revenue side, and this is where inflation quietly cuts both ways. Higher prices are painful for ordinary people, no question. But when prices, wages, and corporate profits all rise in nominal yen, the government tends to collect more tax in nominal yen too. And that extra revenue gives the Ministry of Finance some room to maneuver. Here's a real example from 2026. Japan put together an emergency spending package worth about 3.1 trillion yen, or roughly $19 billion, mostly to cushion households from a spike in energy costs. Normally, extra spending like that means dumping more bonds on the market. But this time, even though the package was technically funded by issuing new bonds, the government leaned on stronger than expected tax revenue and other non-tax income to offset it. So the total amount of new bonds actually hitting the market stayed flat. And the less extra supply the market has to absorb, the less pressure there is for yields to spiral higher. The third possible lever is bond buybacks, which the Ministry of Finance already routinely conducts. Right now, this is mostly a technical debt management operation, but Reuters reported that Japan has not ruled out scaling this up as a future option. To be clear, this is not a lever Japan is actively pulling at scale yet. It's more like an emergency option sitting on the shelf, untested at that scale, but it's there. So look, despite all these levers, I'm sure there are still people who tell you that Japan's exploding yields are going to sink the country no matter what. And hey, maybe I'm missing something, and by no means am I a finance expert. All I ask you to do is just look under the hood. First of all, yields jumping to 2.7% does not mean Japan's entire debt suddenly cost 2.7% across the board, okay? The new higher rate does not retroactively apply to the trillions of yen in old bonds already locked in at near zero. Those old bonds keep paying their tiny original coupons until the day they mature. The higher rate only kicks in on the new bonds Japan issues to replace them, one batch at a time, year after year. So the average interest rate on the whole pile climbs slowly, not all at once. Even in a scenario where the 10-year government bond rate moves to 3%, which is higher than where it is today, Japan's debt servicing bill is projected to rise from about 31 trillion yen, or roughly $200 billion in 2026, to around 40 trillion yen, or roughly $260 billion by 2029. That's going from about 25.6% to roughly 30% of the total budget by 2029. And again, this 30% includes both interest payments and debt redemption. If you look only at interest payments, Japan's interest burden in the 2026 budget is only about 10.7% of the total budget. So yes, 30% sounds burdensome, and yes, Japan's debt burden is serious, but That's still a long way from the doomsday picture of debt eating the entire budget and the country suddenly going bankrupt. Based on these numbers, it looks more like a serious budget squeeze than an insane debt collapse. But okay, for the sake of argument, let's say even all the levers I just mentioned aren't enough. Let's say inflation stays sticky, yields kept rising, and the yen remains weak. Is Japan totally out of options? Not exactly, because so far, all the levers we looked at were on the debt or liability side. We haven't even looked at the asset side of Japan's balance sheet. For 34 years, from 1991 until 2024, Japan was the world's largest creditor nation, meaning Japan owned more assets overseas than foreigners owned inside Japan. It has since slipped into third place behind Germany and China, but here's the important part. By the end of 2025, Japan's net external assets were about 562 trillion yen, or roughly $3.5 trillion. Net external assets here means what Japan as a whole nation owns overseas, minus what foreigners own inside Japan. And when I say Japan as a whole, I don't just mean the Japanese government. I also mean Japanese companies, banks, pension funds, insurers, and private investors. Basically, over decades, Japanese institutions accumulated savings, pension money, and corporate profits, and overseas earnings, and invested a huge chunk of that money abroad. So here is why that matters. Out of all that overseas wealth, there is a specific chunk the Japanese government itself directly controls and can actually move in an emergency. It's foreign reserves. As of May 2026, Japan had about $1.3 trillion in official reserve assets. That's a lot, and one hell of a reserve buffer. Japan's foreign reserves are the second largest globally after China. About 932 billion was held in foreign securities, meaning assets like government bonds, and another $162 billion was held as cash-like deposits, mostly with foreign central banks. Here's another fun fact. Japan is the largest foreign holder of US treasuries in the world, ahead of even China. Now, we don't know the exact percentage of US treasuries the Japanese government holds inside that 932 billion securities bucket, but Reuters reports that Japan's foreign currency reserves are mostly held in US treasuries. In plain English, that means these foreign reserves are Japan's state-controlled foreign currency war chest, and Japan is sitting on a shit ton of dollar assets it could tap into if things got really ugly. Let's say Japan were to tap into it. What would that look like in practice? And how does that affect the debt? Well, we don't have to speculate entirely because Japan is already doing part of this. It already spent 11.7 trillion yen, or about $73 billion from its reserves to defend the yen. But this is where I want to be clear. Just because Japan has foreign reserves doesn't mean it can magically use them to pay down domestic debt directly. The main purpose of these reserves is currency defense. The mechanism works like this. If the yen is falling too fast, the Ministry of Finance can instruct the BOJ to intervene. The BOJ then sells dollar assets from Japan's foreign reserves, like US treasuries, receives dollars, sells those dollars in the market, and buys yen. That creates demand for yen and slow or reverse the currency's fall. Makes sense, right? So the foreign reserve is there primarily to defend the yen from crashing, not to directly pay down government debt. But it still indirectly addresses the debt problem by reducing pressure on inflation, interest rates, and ultimately future debt servicing costs. And even after spending around $73 billion in this intervention, Japan still had about $1.3 trillion left in its war chest. Of course, I don't want to make it sound like there will be no consequences if Japan took an extreme measure. In theory, Japan could sell some of these reserves, receive dollars, convert those dollars into yen, and try to use that yen as a funding source for government spending and debt repayment. So an argument could be made here that as long as this is done in a limited way, maybe one-off or a few times in a reasonable amount, the market might not care too much what Japan does with the yen it got from selling those foreign assets. So how much can Japan really tap into? There is no official safe number. But we know around $73 billion in one intervention cycle was possible because that's what Japan just did. A few rounds of that scale are clearly within Japan's firepower. But if Japan tried to dump, say, $300 billion to $500 billion quickly, that'll be a very different story. On the other hand, the real issue is not just the amount, it's also the signal. If Japan starts using its foreign reserves not just to stabilize the currency, but to plug fiscal holes, markets may start asking, what the hell is Japan doing? You see, these reserves are not some free cash sitting in the government's normal bank account. They sit inside the Foreign Exchange Fund Special Account, which was specifically built for currency intervention and has its own liabilities and accounting rules. In fact, Japan borrowed the yen to buy those dollars in the first place, so there is debt sitting on the other side of this special account. So on top of sending the wrong signal to the market, there could also be all sorts of domestic accounting, legal, and political issues involved in moving that money into the regular government budget. The point is that Japan has a serious emergency buffer and it has already shown that it can use it, but only as a last resort backstop, not as a permanent solution. And maybe that's the only lesson I would cautiously apply to the United States. Japan is not a perfect preview of America's future, because every country's debt structure is different. But it does show why just screaming about the total debt number can be misleading. So the real question is, who holds the debt? What currency is it in? How much does it cost to service? And what happens when interest costs and demographics start squeezing the budget? So no, Japan's story does not prove that the US is safe. But it does prove that a rich country borrowing in its own currency may avoid a sudden bankruptcy-style collapse for a very long time while still slowly running out of good options. So look, is Japan totally doomed? Based on everything we dug into, I'm not really convinced of the sudden collapse that the doomsday crowd keeps selling you. But there are serious problems ahead, and the biggest one is demographics. Japan's population is projected to shrink to about 105 million by 2050, down from around 123 million today. That means fewer workers paying taxes and way more retirees drawing pensions and healthcare. No bond market trick fixes that. So even in the best case, where Japan avoids a debt crisis entirely, this is still going to be a very slow, grinding squeeze on ordinary Japanese people. That part is real, and it's already happening. But here's a thing I'll leave you with. This is a country that already survived 30 years of stagnation that wrecked most economies, and the ordinary people of Japan did it by quietly adapting over and over. And for better or worse, when a real crisis hits, I'm not sure there's another country quite like Japan where people pull together with a kind of collective discipline you rarely see anywhere else. So do you really want to bet against them? If history's any guide, I wouldn't. If you found this video insightful and learned something new, make sure to subscribe to Asian Boss. Hit that notification bell and share this video with your family and friends. Our mission is to be the most authentic go-to source for Asia-related insights across business, tech, and culture, and we'll continue to bring you the most in-depth, objective reporting straight from the ground. But there's a problem. Because people are so used to seeing me explain things, they think we come across almost too professional. I'm not a professional at anything, okay? Certainly not in finance or economics. We just do a shit ton of research and ask questions to try to get to the bottom of the issue. But we can do more. We can actually show you how we do our research, discover insights, and fact check. Let me give you an example. We're thinking that our next Japanese topic could be about salaryman culture, where we dig into whether that grinding, brutal working culture is still a thing in Japan today. So if you regularly watch our videos and you have a first-hand account, meaning you're either working or have recently worked inside a Japanese company, I want to hear from you. It could be a tiny Japanese startup or a massive corporation, an old-school firm or something more modern. Doesn't matter. Submit your video intro and tell us what kind of insights you can share when it comes to working culture in Japan. And I'll personally review it and get in touch with you to see if you can come on our future live stream session. Think of it like letting the audience see how we do a straight interview, but in real time with no edits. Then we'll incorporate the insights into our future Salaryman episode. If you think that sounds cool, I totally agree. Let's get you in front of our audience to share your perspective and shape our future episode on Salaryman culture. This is how serious we are about building a truly authentic media platform that can challenge mainstream media, so I hope you'll be a part of it. Of course, I'm Stephen Park. Thanks for watching all the way till the end, and as always, stay curious and send me your video intros.